ECW Anarchy Rulz is a pretty good game, but it still feels like you're playing WWF Attitude, or ECW Hardcore Revolution, or WWF Warzone. Whichever game you entered into on Acclaim's little wrestling series that they did, it's gonna feel pretty much the same. There were a few changes made to kind of separate this game from the others, but the control scheme feels exactly the same. They really didn't change it from WWF Warzone. It looks better than the other Acclaim wrestling games, but you're still doing pretty much the same thing. One nice thing is that they added a few features to this game to at least make it feel more like an ECW game. At this point, those features could be found in other wrestling games though, so yeah, Anarchy Rulz is still saddled with just the same engine, same control scheme, and pretty much the same tedious career mode. It's a little less tedious than the other two versions of this, but yeah, it's pretty much the same. So I'm going to be looking at the Dreamcast version of this game. This was released a few months after the PS1 version. I didn't notice a big difference between the two. Aside from the visuals, this one looks a lot better than the PS1 game. And yeah, for something that's kind of strange, the review scores were kind of negative on this version, and they were pretty neutral on the PS1 version. So there's still not a story mode with this, which isn't a huge problem. The career mode is there, and it was modified a little bit to make it a little less tedious than WWF Attitude or ECW Hardcore Revolution. There were a few other changes made to it, aside from, cosmetics. They did try to make things a little bit better. There were more game modes added to it, but yeah, it's really not anything that you haven't experienced before if you played Attitude or Hardcore Revolution. In the career mode, you can play as a single or tag team career, and then they also added in a stable career mode, which sounds like a good idea. You create a stable of wrestlers, and then you just try to gather all the belts. It sounds like a good idea, but it's just the same thing, so they added a third relatively tedious mode onto this with more to do. I could see it being kind of fun, but yeah, it's not really something that I was interested in when I was playing this. The other game modes are fine. The control scheme is just as awkward as some of the other versions. Man, it's one of those games that I really wanted to like. I don't mind it. It is pretty, decent compared to the other two Dreamcast games that Acclaim released. This isn't the best Dreamcast game, it's just kind of a mediocre one that just happens to be a little better than Attitude and Hardcore Revolution. That's really all I can say about it. It's perfectly fine, it looks good, but you're not really doing anything different than any of the other Acclaim games. The AI in this game seems to kind of swing wildly. I don't know if there was some kind of like a rubber band AI going on here, but it felt like there was, where you're doing really well, then all of a sudden just your opponent starts beating the crap out of you. It seemed alright, and also it just seemed like the AI was way better at the reversals than I was. Like, just absurdly better than anything I was able to do. That was a little frustrating, but it's just something that you'll get used to over time, and eventually you'll figure out all the controls and whatnot. If you're coming from the other Acclaim games, you should be fine. They're going to be essentially the same. If you, just happen to pick this one up and this was your first Dreamcast version of the game, it'll take a little time to get used to because the Dreamcast controller is a little different. But yeah, it's pretty much going to be the same thing. Finding something to really separate this game from the other Acclaim games was pretty hard. There were improvements to the gameplay, there were some improvements to the game modes, but the controls overall aren't really any better than the other Acclaim games. I don't have a huge problem with them, but it takes a little time to get used to, especially if you don't know any of the moves right off the bat. You're going to be opening up the menu a lot. Once you've figured out all the moves that you can do, you don't really need the menu. It's nice that it's there as a reminder, but you don't really need to go back to it. I think out of the 3 Acclaim games on the Dreamcast, this is probably the best. But you're just talking about which one of them is, slightly above average at this point. ECW Anarchy Rulz looks better than the other Acclaim wrestling games on the Dreamcast. While it isn't close to WWF Royal Rumble, it looks better than Hardcore Revolution and WWF Attitude. This is a good-looking Dreamcast game. The ring entrances look a little bit better than the other ECW games. When you look at this as like a sports game, it makes some sense. They just kind of updated what was already there. So you have the same entrances, but that's pretty understandable because a lot of the wrestlers are going to be the same. Yeah, it's one of those things you just should expect from something like this. The character models look better than the other 2 Acclaim games. I like the look of WWF Royal Rumble more. I think Anarchy Rulz isn't too far behind that. The animations are good, and some of the clipping problems kind of have been resolved in this game. There are a few still there, but for the most part, they've just kind of worked that out. The blood mechanics look a lot better in this game. When wrestlers start bleeding, it at least makes more sense. I also kind of like the puddles that appeared on the ring because, hey, if somebody's bleeding like a stuck pig, they're going to be leaving blood on the ring, so that makes a lot more sense. This is a good-looking game. It looks better than WWF Attitude and ECW Hardcore Revolution, but not as good as WWF Royal Rumble. The graphics are probably the best part of this game. So it was really surprising to see the reviews for Anarchy Rulz and how much, the Dreamcast version was hated by reviewers. They were all lower for the Dreamcast version of ECW Anarchy Rulz than they were for the PS1 version. There is one outlier, and that is GameSpot's review. GameSpot gave the game a 6.5 out of 10, and this was higher than the PS1 version of the game. The reviewer noted the changes that were made to the game, but pointed out kind of the lack of change to the control scheme, which, it needed to be changed. It was very old at this point, and it wasn't particularly great with Attitude, or I think he mentioned Attitude, but it wasn't great with Warzone to begin with, so them just reusing the same control scheme, it was really showing its age and needed to be updated. Sadly, this was the last ECW game, and we didn't get another one after that. Game Informer had 2 reviews for this, and the initial review score was 3 out of 10, and then the second opinion was 3.25 out of 10. They correctly pointed out all the flaws in this and everything like that, and then they said something that just kind of really bugged me, and I don't think that I could just ignore. The second reviewer, the quote that he gave it was, note to self, eat dinner, call parents, then assassinate the development team. I'm not sure why the editor let that one go through. I mean, there's a harsh review, and then there's something like this that just should not have been put into the review. I realize that, the gaming media likes to point out when people, like the gamers, call in death threats to developers, and I haven't seen a publication do it before, so seeing this here was really kind of shocking. And when the media calls for killing the developers, I think that should also be pointed out. Thankfully, they don't really do that anymore. Electronic Gaming Monthly, to shift back to something normal, Electronic Gaming Monthly gave this a 4 out of 10. I think their review sums it up nicely when they said it can't really shake the musty smell of WWF Attitude, which is fair. I think that's probably the most honest thing that any of the reviews have said about it. And they kind of expressed some hopes for WWF Royal Rumble. I probably should have looked at their review, but I didn't do it for that game. Interestingly, the reviewers only really went back to WWF Attitude when they were critiquing this game, especially when they were talking about the control scheme, and they don't mention that it started with Warzone. It seemed a little odd to me, but I'm guessing they just felt they didn't need to go all the way back to that. Whatever, though. I'm looking at this in hindsight, and I'm sure these guys were not expecting some jackass to come back 20 years later and critique the review for it. Or at least go back and read the review for it. I kind of agree with the GameSpot review. It's a slightly above average game, but it's not good. And that's essentially what a 6.5 was back then, so yeah. Whoever wrote that one, I think they did a good job with it. The person who called for violence against the developer team, they just... I kind of hope they're not in game journalism anymore, because they really shouldn't be. ECW Anarchy Rulz is probably the most complete wrestling game on the console, or at least on the Dreamcast. It's not really great. It's just slightly above average, and honestly, I would rather play WWF Royal Rumble than this. I just think that one's a little bit more fun than going through kind of the more tedious game modes in this. The developers tried to, improve on the previous installment, but they just added a new coat of paint and a few game modes and never fixed any of the underlying issues that had been present with all of Acclaim's wrestling games, from Warzone all the way up until this one. It's not a bad game. If you liked any of the Acclaim wrestling games, you'll probably like this one. But yeah, it's not anywhere near as good as the SmackDown games or, WWF WrestleMania 2000 or No Mercy. And I think I like a few of the WCW games more than this as well. Anyway, that's going to wrap things up. Let me know what you think in the comments below, and I will talk to you all later. Bye.